today's event, and I'm Yushan Xie, postdoc researcher at SKOPE, and today we're very grateful to have Gavin, Killip, and Marina Topouzi to join us to talk about vocational skills for green. It's a really exciting topic, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions and thoughts around what are the green skills for the future, and especially for industry construction. Can people online hear us all right? Can you give us a signal? Can you hear us? Okay, yes. Cool. Without further ado, I'll hand over to both of them, and we're probably going to speak for 45 minutes, and then we'll have questions for the room and also from.
Thanks, Yushan. Thanks everyone for coming, both in the room and online. My colleague Marina is here in the room. You'll see in a minute there's a couple of other people who are not here. But yeah, a quick talk on vocational skills for green construction based on some research we did last year. How ready is the system to prepare the workforce? I don't think it surprised you to hear that actually not very ready at all is the answer. But we'll give you a little bit of detail and hopefully have an interesting discussion about what we have done. There is quite a bit to get through, so I will probably talk for half an hour or so. I'll try and do it as quickly as I can and get on to the discussion. We're very interested to hear your reflections and ideas about these things. If I can advance the slides. Just talk amongst yourselves whilst we have a little technical moment. Okay. So myself, Gavin, Killip, and Marina Topouzi were in the room, and we did this research with Kate Simpson and Rachel McCrory at Nottingham Trent University as well. And between us, we have, quite a diverse background in terms of there being geographers, building scientists, architects, systems thinkers in the team. And the reason for that really is because climate change is one of these grand challenge topics, which it doesn't really lend itself to sort of solo discipline analysis. So the image there is intended to sort of represent us trying to build a bridge and hoping that others from other disciplinary backgrounds will be equally interested and help building the bridge from the other side, so that we have well-founded, properly robust research that manages to make these bridges between different disciplines. We've done what we can, but we're conscious of not being educationalists, for example. So it'd be interesting to hear what you people have to say. So we did this research last year, like I said. It was a slightly unusual research project in terms of university research. Our client was the Construction Industry Training Board, which at the time we started worked under license from the Department for Education. It now seems to work for the Department for Work and Pensions. But we did a study for them combining a literature review and various stakeholder meetings, some interviews, and also a survey of training providers. And the aim was to help the Construction Industry Training Board, the CITB, understand the subsector of repair and maintenance of existing housing. And you can see the different aims of the project there. Some of the aims that we were given proved completely impossible to answer. Assess the current quality of RMI training, for example, if within the time, not really possible. We have some insights, we think, about how things are working. And then a brief summary. We did, a bit of a mixed methodology. There are some interviews, there's some data analysis, there's some lack of data thinking, what do you do when you haven't got enough data and so on. But we also, because we were doing this for a construction body, and the construction body has on offer some £3 million of funding for the industry to spend on its own training, people were quite keen to engage with us and talk to us about what they wanted the funding spent on, which of course brings its own biases, so you have to be aware of those. But it also meant that we were able to engage with quite a lot of stakeholders quite quickly, which, given the timing of the project, was really helpful. There's quite a lot of background to this, and I come from a perspective of how do we solve climate change, which starts with a sort of technology, economics, engineering perspective, and then moves into workforce development and then sort of education. I've said here some key facts and figures. I'm trying to give these as a sort of quick overview to help people who are maybe not so familiar with this terrain. There's much more that could be said, but here we go. We have about 30 million homes in this country, and depending on how you measure it, they are responsible for a quarter to a fifth of carbon dioxide emissions from the UK's inventory. If we're going to achieve net zero, which we say we're going to achieve, then we need several things to be in place all at the same time. We need to get away from gas boilers. Most people in this audience will have a gas boiler at home. That's burning fossil fuel, and we need to stop burning fossil fuel. But it's more than that. We need to electrify heating mostly. Other technologies are also available and may be relevant. We need to completely decarbonise the electricity grid. So lots and lots more wind, lots more solar power on the system. We need some degree of improvement to building fabric, which is the envelope of buildings, largely through insulation, but also other things that could be done to reduce the amount of energy that we need, whilst also maintaining comfort and service. In order to achieve all of that, we need a market to do repair, maintenance and improvement work and build in those energy efficient technologies and materials. And in order to achieve that, we need a competent workforce. Okay, I'm not going to read all of the text on this. It's there for your study afterwards if you choose to. But this is a diagram from the Climate Change Committee from a few years ago. And it's basically listing, if you like, the technology solutions that could be appropriate, both for existing housing and for new construction in housing. And it talks about things like low carbon heating systems, insulation, improved glazing, improving air tightness, so having ventilation systems that work. So it's a very kind of technological perspective on the sorts of things that need to be done. And these sorts of studies do tend to assume that all of this technology will be deployed perfectly first time and never need maintenance, which is where I start to depart from believing in it so wholeheartedly. Another bit of context, people talk about the construction industry as if it was one thing, and it's not. It's several things. It helps, I think, to think of it in terms of subsectors. And there are broadly three subsectors. There's housing, which we're interested in, but there's also industrial and commercial buildings, which comes up as I and C on this chart. So this is warehouses, shopping centres, churches, hospitals, everything that's not a home, but also infrastructure, things like HS2, new roads, airport runways, all of those sorts of things. And if you think of those three as different chunks of construction, you can further subdivide it into new construction, which is the solid colours on that pie chart, and also repair, maintenance and improvement of all of those things. So if you follow that logic, the slice of the pie at sort of 9 o'clock on that chart is repair, maintenance and improvement of housing. It fluctuates, but it was worth over £40 billion a year in the UK economy in 2023, and roughly 18% of the total of construction. So it's not the biggest chunk, but it's a significant chunk. And it tends to be a bit of a Cinderella topic. The new construction sectors tend to get more attention, and housing tends not to get as much attention as it could. Okay, this is one slide summarising an awful lot of information. There has been policy for housing and energy system change, and I've broken it down in terms of the tenure type. So this is owned homes, this is rented homes, and within the rented home sector, there's both renting off a private landlord and renting off a social landlord, so a social housing provider. You can see the split. About 2/3 is owner occupied, and you can see the split with the rental sector. But because of the way, the history of these things, we have three broad goals, which is to achieve a transition which is affordable, not cheap, but affordable. It achieves complete decarbonisation, but it's also consistent with economic growth. Those are the sort of policy goals writ large. We can disagree with some of them if we wish, but those nonetheless are the goals. And what that tends to translate to in housing is we have some rather piecemeal policy and financial support offered to different sectors, different amounts of attention paid to different sectors. There's quite a strong focus on vulnerable households because of the sort of regressive way that the money is collected. There's a desire to help people who are in disadvantaged households more. The social rented sector tends to have the greatest regulation and control, including requirements for training for the workforce to be involved in projects that are paid for by government spending. There's a little bit of talk about controlling the private rented sector, but it hasn't quite happened in a meaningful way yet. And then for owner occupiers, there are grants available, but it's basically a free market and you do what you want. There's some sweeteners and incentives to help you switch to a heat pump, for example. And then, of course, the elephant in the room is that there's actually been quite a few high-profile failures in this space in recent years. I've put 2 up there. I could have put 2 or 3 others up. Just before Christmas 2025, there was a report that came out that 2 of the insulation programs, more than 90% of the installations had quite serious problems with them. So that's the one on the left. And the effect of this is that people get damp in their buildings and the walls start to deteriorate, and then they end up with mold. And the thing that was supposed to improve the quality of their home actually ends up making it worse. And then the other one, of course, is Grenfell Tower, which 72 people tragically lost their lives in a disaster which was caused by, well, a whole host of misadventures. Policy doesn't come out of it well, industry doesn't come out of it well, local government doesn't come out of it well. But the Grenfell Tower inquiry report shows that the insulation cladding on the outside of the building, the way it was done and the corners that were cut contributed to the very rapid spread of the fire. So that's, if you like, a bit of context. And this is not a comfortable space for us to be talking about, let's do renovation of buildings. Okay, the research findings. This is taken from the United States ONET information service. And I think it's helpful to think about green skills in these terms. There's 3 broad categories that ONET comes up with. So there's green or new emerging occupations. So this is completely new jobs. And the example we've got from the housing and RMI retrofit space is the retrofit coordinator. And this is a new role which has been only come into existence in the last few years. Marina actually sits on the national committee overseeing the standards behind the definition of what a retrofit coordinator is. But it's a new role that's come into the system. The second one is what they call green enhanced skills occupations. And actually, this is where the bulk of the problem is, because it's the largest bit of the workforce where their work practices need to change and therefore their education needs to change. But if you like, the retrofit coordinator is the person organising other people to do the work and making sure everything is done really well. But the other people doing the work also need to have, competencies and other things going on. So the green enhanced skills occupations could be quite a lot of bricklayers, carpenters, insulation fitters, roofers, all sorts of construction trades, if their competence were changed in some ways. Subtle, in some ways quite profound. And then finally, the ONET has the category of green increased demand, where the job is basically the same, the example being a solar installer, but if we want more solar, then we need more solar installers. Okay. We're going to mainly focus on the middle one in this talk, but it's interesting to think about the new roles that might be needed and the existing ones as well. We did a survey of training providers. We sent out this survey to as many people as we could in the time available, and we asked them if they had data on training outcome, training provision, and they said yes. And we said, would you share it with us? And they said no. Largely, a few of them said they would, but it didn't really help. We learned from this that data is not really collated, analysed and published. It exists, but it exists in a very fragmented form. And the CITB themselves, even though they operate under licence from the Department for Education, don't have access to the DFE data. They're not given it. It's very hard to get an overview of what's really going on in the vocational education and training space based on this. Certainly if you're interested in a sector or a subsector of the economy. Okay. There's a photograph on the right there of a building site. It's actually my kitchen a few years ago. The point is that if you're going to make these changes to a building, it makes sense to do them all together. So this is a new kitchen being fitted in a building, which many people might think is a normal thing to do. But would you insulate the walls and insulate the floors and change the heating system and think about solar on the roof at the same time? That's the time to do it if you think about it in terms of a market-led opportunity for doing things. And what this diagram on the left is trying to say is 2 things. One is that the repair and maintenance and the retrofit for energy purposes are linked. They're connected in quite interesting ways, but also they're cyclical. So these things don't just happen once, fit and forget. We need to think about maintenance of these systems. That kitchen, I just had some maintenance done on it only 2 weeks ago. You know, these things, nothing lasts forever. So the maintenance aspect of it comes in. I think I've hinted at this already, but the quality really matters. A lot of the policy targets talk about quantities, numbers of technology deployments. The photograph on the left is someone living in a very comfortable, warm, easy and cheap to heat home that has had a lot of this physical work done to the building. She's happy, it's healthy, it's comfortable. It can be done. But as we saw with the National Audit Office report on the insulation programs and high-profile failures, when it's done badly, you end up with things like picture in the middle and plaster falling off the wall and mould growing in corners. And the final issue about quality is actually the gap between design intent and real-life performance. It doesn't get monitored very often, but when it does, and the reason it doesn't get monitored very often is it's time-consuming and expensive to do it properly. But there is a gap of 50 to 100% in what people think is happening in energy performance in buildings to what actually is happening. And there's some evidence that shows the meticulous attention to detail in doing it is one of the key things to reduce that gap significantly. Again, it comes back to workforce and development. The summary of this report said there were 3 broad issues. One was lack of technical understanding, one was poor communication skills, and the last one was unclear roles and responsibilities. So these are all about the social organisation of labour and the education system, ultimately. Okay, I'm aware that competence is still a contested term in educational circles, but this is what we used in our study, and we borrowed it from the CITB themselves. So we're using this combination of SKEB, skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviour to think about what comprises competence, but also that the validation, the assessment has got to be independent, or there's got to be some sense of quality assurance in the assessment itself of deciding when a person becomes competent. We've also borrowed from engineering, actually, the idea of a T-shaped professional. And this gives you, you've got a T-shape which is this, and it gives you a deep specialism this way, but it gives you a broad understanding of several issues which cut across several different job roles. And so the idea of the T-shaped professional is that you have essential knowledge in multiple areas, which is shared, as well as your specific task that you are the specialist in. And you can see that there are various experience and behaviour characteristics distributed around that diagram as well. But if we think about the labour markets, not just the skills training, we see that actually the construction sector at this level has a lot of the characteristics of what is called a low skills equilibrium, which is to say there's not very much demand for the skill in the marketplace, and there's not much provision or supply of good quality skill. And actually the reason it stays like that, I'm sorry that the arrows seem to have shifted, is you can start anywhere on that circle on the left-hand side and start at the top. We observe skills and labour shortages. One of the effects of that is you have a constrained capacity to innovate in the system, and you end up with a high rate of low-skilled jobs. Because you have a low-skilled jobs market, there's low demand for training. But actually, if someone does do training, one of their opportunities is to then get out of that sector and find employment elsewhere. So as people begin to train up, they may leave, and then you remain with a situation which has low appeal for skilled workers, and then you're back at the skills and job shortage. So you've got this sort of vicious circle described in this report, which is kind of interesting. The report also talks about ways out of it, which is quite interesting, but it's not a simple solution. And then just to say, the alternatives to a low skills equilibrium can be, well, they can be overqualification and they can be underqualification, but the sweet spot that we're probably aiming for is some degree of professionalism, where there's high demand and high supply of good quality competence in the workforce. It's a long way from where we are. There's a lot of talk about skills gaps, particularly in construction. And this is what we summarised in our report for the CITB as what we think is really going on. There's not a skills gap that can be easily resolved by simply putting on more training courses. I don't think that's a surprise to this audience, but it was a surprise to them. Instead, there is a dysfunctional system between skills training and jobs. The people with the training don't necessarily do jobs which the training was intended, and the people who do work in the sector don't necessarily have the right training or indeed any training at all. So it's not a gap that can just be plugged with something simple. It's a broken system that needs proper thinking about. And then this is some of the research evidence from interviews with different actors in the sector, actually. There's awarding bodies, training providers, colleges, innovative training providers, independents, all sorts of people. The whole thing is unregulated. Anybody can do whatever they want. People are setting up courses without consistent standards. People are doing what they want in order to get bums in seats, but there's no sort of overarching strategy. The one on the left is an example of a course that was set up, a policy that was set up to insist on having retrofit coordinators, the new role. What the government wanted to do was to make sure that the retrofit coordinator was doing their job without it costing any money. So what happened was there was a race to the bottom where the money, people would say, we can do it cheaper than that. And by what they meant by we can do it cheaper than that was we can fill in the paperwork for you and tick the boxes without even going to the building site that we're supposed to be inspecting. So they ended up with this nice term, pajama coordinators, where somebody is supposed to be managing a workforce, but they're just doing it from their bedroom remotely. The idea that there's any kind of quality assurance in that system, I think, is laughable, really. And there's other things. There's issues about assessment and enrolment and accreditation, deciding when an apprentice is ready and when they're qualified, and the pressures that are put on educational institutions to say that things are perhaps better or more ready than they are. Okay. I put this one up, but not because it's, you have to take this with a little bit of a pinch of salt. We got this from one awarding body using their own data. And so you can't say that it's completely representative, but that says two things. One is this data is really hard to get hold of. The idea of trying to analyse what apprenticeships are happening and how well they're performing within a subsector of a sector of the economy is really hard with available data. But also, well, you can see here, if you look at those figures, the construction sector is underperforming compared to all of the whole economy on every count. So apprenticeships in construction tend to be underpaid, unreliable. They're not happy with the quality of the teaching. They're not happy with the supervision in the workplace. These are reasons why people didn't complete their apprenticeship. Yeah, they didn't feel supported. They didn't feel that it was actually working for them. Of course, not in every case. It's possible to find examples of really good practice where it's great. But how do you get a picture of across the piece? Well, this is an initial picture, but we don't have the data to be more sure. Again, this is a slightly busy slide. I'm not going to read all of it to you, but we also see divergence. We're working for the Construction Industry Training Board, and their remit is Great Britain, so England, Scotland, and Wales, not Northern Ireland. And so we did a bit of work talking to sort of policymakers and others invested in different parts of the GB training sector. And we're beginning to see divergence. You know, as the education devolution agenda moves forward, we're beginning to see some quite interesting initiatives in Scotland and Wales, particularly not adequately resourced, not there yet, but nonetheless different from England. And I think it's fair to say that England is most characterised by lots and lots of short-term initiatives announced and then with very short deadlines, which just encourages a sector that makes quick use of the money. It doesn't actually have any strategic content at all. So there are questions about uneven access to training. There's issues to do with regional economies and how training might fit better with different places, with different kinds of economy. We found examples of some quite interesting innovations. For example, this one at the bottom on the left, the Green Skills Advisory Panel. But these are bottom-up initiatives set up by, in this case, Exeter College, wanting to do some interesting things to try and convene and coordinate. But we also came across examples of this sort of activity, which when it started was great, but then it didn't last. So the skills development matrix in Scotland is still talked about, but actually it's not kept up to date because it was a voluntary committee of enthusiasts in the industry wanting to make something better, but they weren't supported long term to make it stick. There's various other things in there. Like I say, I don't have time to go into all of them. And then the other piece that comes out of, if you like, the sort of energy transitions community, there's a lot of excitement about smart energy systems. We're going to digitize everything, and we're going to have Internet of Things, and we're going to monitor everything. There's going to be new business models and new kinds of service where everything is monitored in real time, and businesses are going to make their living out of really good granular analysis of real-time data. So that's an example of what might happen with the idea of keeping track of a building and what's happened to it, and how that change affects its energy performance and the satisfaction of its occupants. It's a sort of brave new world of smart systems that could be interesting. But these things are going to change the materiality of the building. Buildings get changed all the time anyway. If you think back to the £40 billion a year being spent on knocking homes around. So how is the workforce doing the knocking the buildings around going to take account of these digital systems? Are they going to work with it or against it, ignore it? We don't know. And then, the data system itself is only as good as whether it's up to date and accurate. So over time, if it's not kept up to date and accurate, it's going to become, less and less useful. Who is going to update it? Who is going to ensure the accuracy? And what are the risks of getting it wrong? Unknown. Okay. A few conclusions and some recommendations. Apologies for the funny way the S has moved along. So retrofit policy is inadequate, I think it's fair to say, if we're going to decarbonise the whole of 30 million homes. The industry and the vocational education and training system are really not ready for this. There is, talk about it, and there's some interesting innovations, but system-wide, it's not really there. I think I've shown that the data on training is just not analysed and published in a useful and helpful way. There are standards, but they're quite inconsistent. There are lots of conflicts of interest in the system, and we came across quite a few race to the bottom practices. Okay, we only did 24 interviews, but there were quite a lot of different ways in which policy is being undermined by people doing things as quickly and cheaply as possible, rather than doing them well and thinking strategically. It's fragmented, it's confused. Now, these new directions, I call them, on jobs and on developing competence. I mean, it's easy to say this, it's not straightforward to do it, but the industry needs to start focusing on outcomes rather than just inputs. It needs to think about what's going to happen and how it's going to perform, not just have I got enough money to recruit this person, and think about cost and materials. They need to think about what happens later on. They don't at the moment, and it's a big challenge. Some new policy, licensing the construction sector, so you can only join the industry if you have the minimum qualifications of competence, is an interesting idea. Some people are for it in the sector, some people are dead against it. It would be incredibly complicated and full of risk to do it, but it's something there. You have to be. Okay. And then the competence question, I think the principle of the skills, knowledge, experience and behaviour gives us a good enough framework to think about competence, but the action across those things needs to be coordinated. We came across plenty of evidence of people training young people to do a job that only a more experienced person should be doing, for example. The independence of assessment is an issue. We came across, again, it's hard to be sure about the exact numbers, but we certainly came across examples of not very good practice. And we need to think about future skills. We need to be preparing a workforce not for what needed to be done 5 years ago, but also what needs to be done in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. So this goes back to the digital skills and the innovation piece as well. And also for them to be able to navigate a world which is uncertain. What skills and competence do you need to navigate a world full of uncertainty? Okay. Three quick sets of recommendations. They're not actually that quick, but I'm just going to skate through them, and I'm going to let you read them in your leisure afterwards. But we rather boldly decided that we were going to recommend things for government, for CITB, and for the sector skills. So this is the kind of national and devolved government section, and it's saying create a strategy. We need to have much more joined up thinking across the piece in relation to climate policy, energy policy, housing policy, vocational education and training, and a few other things besides. There aren't really any good delivery models for doing that. It's one thing to have the strategy as a report on the wall, but the delivery, actually getting to do it, is just absent, save for a few small initiatives. Work with industry, strengthen coordination and knowledge sharing, do that piece of finding the good practice and amplifying it as best as possible. We've argued that they should at least consult on something like a license to trade. And then the data question. Why can't it be collected, analysed and published in a more useful and meaningful way? Moving on, the CITB themselves. CITB is a curious organisation, but they like to say that they are industry-led because they basically take industry's money as a levy, as a training board levy, and then reallocate the money for training. And because they're using the industry's money, they like to say that they are industry-led. We're saying that's fine, but actually the industry doesn't speak with one voice. So it's kind of meaningless. What they should do instead is be quality-led, and they should become advocates for a much stronger focus on quality across the piece, which will resonate with some industry people, not with others, but we should also be bringing in other stakeholder voices. Integrate advice from outside, that's saying something similar. They don't really think about future skills capabilities. They're very much rooted in the present and the immediate short-term future, but that could and should change. They don't commission research of the kind that we've just been doing very often, but they have the capability and the resource to do that, so we think they should. Commit to housing, retrofit, and so on. The one at the bottom seems to have dropped off the bottom, I'm afraid, but this is talking about learning from underrepresented voices, including women and the small businesses that they should represent and others. And then the sector skills plan itself, we were taken on to come up with recommendations for the sector skills plan. How should they be spending their money in the short to medium term for repair, maintenance and improvement and retrofit in housing? And so we've given them these 4 principles. Use the T-shaped professional idea as a sort of hanger to hang it off. But standards need to be applied consistently, and that's both educational standards, but also things like building regulations. The PAS is the standard one. It's a British Standards Institute shorthand for a standard, and it's the thing that Marina sits on the committee of. Publicly available specification. Is that what it is? Something like that. Except it's not publicly available without money. So it's the training needs to think about outcomes, not just inputs. So we need to be training people and learning the effect of what they do, and not just what they do, but what the team does and how their work interacts with someone else. And the quality, the independence of the quality assurance also needs to be thought about. And then we gave them this. Again, I'm not going to read them all to you, but this basically is saying find the good practice and use the funding to prioritise things that have a chance of expanding it. This is in the kind of immediate short term. So don't just give the money to people who want more scaffolding courses. Not to say that there's wrong with scaffolding courses, but if they were serious about this net zero agenda, then we need to go much further than just putting on more scaffolding courses. So those are the first 4, and then there's a few more there. Try and get rid of the conflicts of interest. Give some funding to initiatives that begin to convene and coordinate good practice. Okay. Whew. Wow, that was a lot. So future research, we've done this. It took us 9 months, but actually we've been thinking about this for years, as you can probably tell. We're interested in collaborations. We're interested in working with people from other disciplines, with other perspectives. And so here are some of our research ideas, but we very much welcome yours, your thoughts, your comments, your counterfactuals, anything else that you would like. But we think, you know, 4 big topic areas. There's an issue here about supply, demand, and use of skills, sort of making the connection between education and employment and the workplace. Governance arrangements in education and training systems, and particularly the link between the education and the outcomes, which I think is probably quite difficult to achieve, but you know, maybe there's some progress we can make there. New technology, there's lots of excitement and hype around the new technology, but what about the critical thinking that's needed, and how might we begin to think about developing competence around that, both in this sector, but also in other sectors? And then I suppose, you know, one of my particular hobby horses at the moment is labour market regulation. You know, would it work? How could you make it work? How could you reduce the risks? Is there an alternative to this, or is it actually the only thing to do and we just have to do it properly? And can we learn lessons from other sectors? What lessons can we learn from other countries? You know, there's a lot of potential for international comparison. So that's it from us. Quite a quick scoot through quite a lot of stuff. Thank you for your attention. If you have any comments, questions, ideas, if you think it's all a load of rubbish and you want to tell us why, there's our email addresses. We welcome the debate.